Good to see everyone this evening. We are in 2 Corinthians chapter 7. We'll wrap chapter 7 up, Lord willing, tonight. Anytime I get into these epistles, sometimes I feel like Paul could make his third missionary journey quicker than I can teach it. You wonder sometimes, to be quite honest with you, whether, can you imagine the Corinthians getting this letter? Would they have dealt with it in the same fashion that we do? Would they have gone, well, this word means, and that word means, and this word means, and you wonder if they did a better job of getting big picture than we do sometimes. I'll never know. Maybe if I get a chance, if heaven allows for people to sit down and converse with folks from Corinth, I'll ask them how they went about addressing these letters as they came. But be that as it may, we're trying to grasp as much as we can from the things that Paul shares with them in hopes that we can make application and appreciate that. So thank you for everyone who's here tonight. For those at home who are joining us as well, we appreciate you being with us as we continue in this study and again try to wrap up chapter 7 this evening. We're dealing here towards the end of this chapter a little bit where Paul said, he used lots of words, right? He talked about how vehement they were and how indignation they were and how careful they were and how in their approach towards addressing the problems that he spoke of in his first letter. He's excited because who has been able to come back and talk to him about their receptiveness? Titus, right? And so in fact, he'd been kind of waiting. He wasn't going to just go and make a straight line for Corinth. He wanted to be able to have a conversation with Titus, who he sent ahead, to get a sense of how they received this letter before he actually arrives there again on the scene. So he's gotten word. He's talking to them a little bit about how he appreciates the information he gets from Titus about how they received that and how they approached it. And now verse 12, he says, "Wherefore, though I wrote unto you, I did it not for his cause that had done the wrong, nor for his cause that suffered wrong, but that our care for you in the sight of God might appear unto you." I find that somewhat interesting because Paul basically says, when I wrote that letter, I wasn't trying to write to whom? All right, so I wasn't writing to the guilty person, and I wasn't writing to the person whom he wronged, but I was writing to whom? Yeah, to the group. The letter was intended for the group. My conclusion about that is that if Paul had been directly dealing with the individual who had committed the sins that he outlines in the first letter, my guess is he probably would have written that letter vastly differently. His approach towards writing the letter was to write to the church at Corinth. And if you go back in your mind's eye for a minute and think about that first letter, much of what Paul said was not as much about what that guy should do about it, but what they should do about it. What they should be doing about this situation and how their approach towards this situation was not what it ought to be. And so it's kind of fascinating when you think about it. But Paul says basically, when I wrote this letter, it wasn't for the guy, it wasn't for him that had done the wrong or the one, but it was for them. It was for the church. It was so that they could understand how they should approach and respond to this situation. And notice his definition, but that our care for you in the sight of God might appear unto you. Paul's concerned that the divisiveness going on in Corinth might eventually do what? To split the whole thing wide open. If I don't address the problems of people going, I am of Paul, and I am of Apollos, and I am of Cephas, you remember those early writings in the first letter. If Paul can't get the church there at Corinth to address that problem, he may have a splintered church before he's done. If he can't get them to address the problem of a man who has his father's wife, that leaven could eventually what? Spread and leaven the entire church. If they don't address the issues of idolatry, then the problem is going to persist and they may end up not being anywhere near what they should be as followers of Jesus. And so Paul writes the letter to the church at Corinth how they should be addressing these situations, and then basically in the second letter reminds them of that. My effort in writing to you was not about the individuals as much as it was the whole. And the truth is, when you talk to individuals and you speak to the whole, those are two completely different conversations. And you know, I think sometimes we forget that when you preach. Sometimes the conversation is about what the group should be doing. Sometimes the conversations are encouraging what individuals should be doing, and those are two different kinds of conversations. And you approach that situation two different ways because your end result that you're trying to gain is different. And so it's an interesting just caveat of thought as it relates to why Paul wrote it, how he wrote it, and it maybe gives us a little bit of a better appreciation for why he said the things that he did in the first letter. Because now you've got this clarity that he was trying to speak to them as a group, not to any particular individual that was present there. Go ahead, Bob. Well, I mean, no. And Paul or Bob's question is: Did all the churches at that time have elders? And I would conclude the answer to that be no, because that's what he sends Timothy and Titus and those guys out to do, is to establish those churches with elderships and leadership as it relates to that. And so not all would have had. And it is interesting that so if your thought is that they would need guidance as to how to address these kinds of problems because they maybe don't have that leadership in place as yet. And I'd have to go back in my mind's eye and think about Corinth in specific as it relates to that. I'm trying to think about timing of that event. Anyway, I'll look at that. Yeah. If the church was going to get past this division, if it was going to get past this situation with how they were addressing sinful practices among them, they were going to have to do that as a collective. And many a church has been challenged and suffered because they tried to address problems without getting the whole behind it, without getting the entire group behind what they were trying to accomplish and fulfill. Maybe a couple over here were addressing something, maybe a couple over there, but not the entire group. I think that was one of the things that was impressive. If you think about that issue at Antioch, and if you remember over Judaizing teachers, and they sent Paul and Barnabas back down into Jerusalem, and that narrative there, I think in Acts 15, talks about how the whole church assembled to hear what the apostles and elders had to say, and they got behind the message to address that problem. And I think that's important here for Corinth as well. And Paul challenges them to appreciate that they all needed to get behind this situation, and it appears they have. It appears that this group has taken what Paul has said to heart and are dealing with it from a collective standpoint. Verse 13. Therefore we were comforted in your comfort. Yea, and exceedingly the more joyed we for the joy of Titus, because his spirit was refreshed by you all. I imagine it was a bit of a sigh of relief to Paul to find out that when Titus got there, they didn't mistreat him or challenge him or cause any trouble for him based on the way that Paul had written the letter. It could have been going the exact opposite. They could have had a horrible reception for Titus and not received him at all. But Paul found comfort in the fact that when he got there, he was received. And that's the message Titus brings back. For if I have boasted anything to him of you, I am not ashamed, but as we spake all things to you in truth, even so our boasting, which I made before Titus, is found a truth. Have you ever vouched for somebody and been nervous about it? And I don't know that Paul's nervous about it, but he seems nervous about it. And what I mean by that is he's apparently told Timothy a lot of good. You wouldn't have got that if you just read the first letter, right? you wouldn't think that Paul had much good at all to say about the church at Corinth. But you're only hearing, if you're only making that decision based on this letter that he wrote, then that's not enough information to draw that conclusion. It's apparent that along with this pretty heavy letter that he sends, he also told Titus some good things about the church at Corinth. He also informed him about the good, and he was excited to hear that that's exactly what Titus found when he arrived there. That all the boasting that he did about the church at Corinth was exactly what Titus found. It found it to be true when he arrived. And his inward affection is more abundant toward you, whilst he remembereth the obedience of you all, how with fear and trembling you received him. And so Titus found them exactly as Paul would describe he would find them. He's received well by them, even though they had some challenging things to address and difficulties to have to answer. Paul finds joy in that. Titus is encouraged by the way they've received and treated him. And in fact, he says, I rejoice therefore that I have confidence in you all in all things. I like that word because I think it's important, this word confidence. Sometimes expectations require a certain expectation and a level of confidence given to the people that you're giving those expectations to. I think sometimes that you can only imagine here's Paul, and he's trying to deal with all these issues and problems, and he's got his own troubles and difficulties that are surrounding him on a regular basis. And he's finding joy just in the fact that he had every confidence. He displayed that confidence when he wrote the first letter. He's given Titus every reason to believe that things will be found well when he gets to Corinth. And all of these things are coming to fruition. And it's encouraging everybody. The church at Corinth gets encouraged because of it. Titus gets encouraged by it. Paul gets encouraged by it. It's probably some of the most positive things in some senses that Paul has spoken as it relates to his letters to Corinth that we've seen in both letters up to this point. Yeah. Yeah. And the first and second letters happened within the same roughly year, but yet you can imagine those weeks would come and go and waiting for Titus to get back and has all this confidence, is it paid off? Is it really what it's supposed to be? So it's interesting to think about how he would have received all that eventually and how he must have felt when it finally got there. Any other thoughts about chapter 7? Any questions or anything as it relates to chapter 7? I apologize. Give me 1 second. I kind of forgot to pull up the questions so we could look at them. But if you have your questions for chapter 7, you can pull those up and we'll go through them real quick here by way of summary for the chapter, and then we'll move into chapter 8. So we ask this question, what should we perfect in the fear of God? Okay, holiness, that's right. And what plea does Paul make in verse 2? Say it one more time. That's all right. Okay, yeah. Open up to us and this connection that they have. What we're without and within in verse 5. Okay, yeah, fightings and fears, anxiousness all around them. What does God do for those who are cast down? He comforts, right, and encourages in those challenges. Was Paul apologetic about the forceful letter that he had sent to them? Trick question, right? That's right. Yeah. Yes and no. No, but he did. But yes, but he didn't regret writing it. You could answer that in a lot of different ways, actually. In some senses, no. He was not apologetic. He said, I needed to write it. You needed to hear it, and I needed to write it. It made him feel bad that it kind of cut to the heart of them. He didn't find any pleasure in the fact that they were brought to sorrow over it. But it needed to be done. So from that standpoint, he was unapologetic. What does godly sorrow work towards? Repentance. And we talked a lot about that when we went through that section. That's real godly sorrow. That's the intent and where it should be leading. Because repentance is about what? Change, yeah. Repentance is about change. Change of will and action. Repentance is about change. And that's what that church needed. And from that standpoint, Paul's more than willing to write the letter if he can produce that kind of sorrow that led to that kind of change. Who was to benefit from Paul's first letter? According to verse 12. Yeah, the whole, right? That was the intent. We saw that tonight in our study. Who had Paul boasted to about the Corinthians? Boasted to them about Titus. And why did Paul rejoice? Yeah, because of the confidence that he had already expressed, right? The confidence that he had already expressed about them was exactly how Titus found them. Again, you put yourself out on a limb sometimes. It can be nerve-wracking. And Paul was excited to hear that Titus found them exactly as he had described, and the confidence that he had placed in them. Okay, let's jump to chapter 8. And if you took chapter 8 independently outside of what's happening in Corinth, you might wonder, well, why? This seems like an odd, all of a sudden we're going to talk about generosity and helping the poor and how it is that we should go about that. But remember, part of what Titus did when he got there was to challenge Corinth to get involved in this helping of others. And so, though it may seem an odd topic, if you were going to make a list of topics, this one might seem like it's out of place in the line of topics that Paul's been talking about. But not when you remember what's going on and what Paul's been encouraging Titus to encourage all these churches to do as it relates to helping those who had need. And so in that sense, it fits perfectly into that mold. So he says, moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. Now, that's not language that you and I would customarily use, but the point's pretty simple. Though they didn't have much, they gave much. I think that's the basic picture here. Church at Macedonia, he said, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. Paul is commending the church at Macedonia, right? They're the church of topic at this point. So he says about this church at Macedonia that if you were going to find a place that might have the means by which to give as they did, that you may not pick the churches at Macedonia as the one that's going to do that. But he said, even despite their own challenges, they gave in what manner? Yeah, what we say liberally. In abundance. For to their power, verse 3, I bear record, yea, and beyond their power, they were willing of themselves. Again, above and beyond what you would have assumed they would be able to do. Within their ability, and then Paul says, and yet even beyond their ability and power. If you would have looked at this church at Macedonia, you would not have thought that they would have been able to accomplish this. There's an old story. I've heard preachers use it, and I'm sure I've read it somewhere. Anyway, I got no idea whether, don't know the source, don't know whether it's true, so treat it as a parable. But it was basically where there was a situation where a group, it was announced that there was a family in need, and that they were going to collect and present that to that family in need. But they announced who the family was. They left it generic. Well, there was a family in that group that didn't have much, but they found ways. Over the course of a couple weeks, they were going to let people raise some money to help. And so this family did odd jobs, and they did all kinds of things so that they could contribute to that cause. And when the money was distributed, it came back to them. And about 90% of it was what they had contributed. Now, I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I'm trying to illustrate that Paul was thankful for places like Macedonia who didn't say, I can't. That I can't wasn't the first thing out of their mouths. They found a way, despite their poverty, despite their trials, despite their challenges, they found a way to get involved above and beyond their power. Now, here's what's interesting about that. Do you see any monetary value prescribed to them? I don't either. Right? So what Paul was talking about here is not that their amount exceeded the amount of somebody else or some other church. I believe what he's highlighting here is that they were giving beyond any kind of expectation you could have asked of that group. That's simply something he's trying to ingrain into the mind of those at Corinth. I bear record, yea, beyond their power, beyond what anybody could have expected of them, they gave liberally, praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift and take upon us the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. I don't know about you, but verse 4 seems to me that Paul kind of went, what? Yeah, you don't need to do this. Right? And what you say, why do you conclude that, Brian? The reason I make that conclusion is the statement he makes in the beginning of verse 4. Praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift. Yeah. If this was something where Paul looked at this and said, yeah, they have means, they have the ability, they don't have to entreat Paul to take it. They don't have to be prayerful. Paul, please, we want to be involved. We've been praying about this. We're entreating you to please receive this from us and let us be part of this ministering to the saints who are in need. There seems to be a conversation between Paul and the church of Macedonia that says, you don't have to do this. I don't expect you to do this. And yet they say, no, we want to do this. We want to be involved in this situation. We want to be helpful. And this they did, verse 5, not as we hoped. Maybe a better word for us would be, not as we would have expected. Right? We've challenged all the churches to help, but we know each church has its own set of limitations and the abilities that they had to provide. So they didn't do just what we might expect from them, but first gave their own selves to the Lord and unto us by the will of God. I want you to think for a moment. It makes great sermon material, but I want to stop in the Bible study and talk about it for a minute. About this idea that he says they first gave what? Yeah, they first gave of themselves. You give self, everything else what? It has to follow. Yeah. Falls in place. Reminds me of an old picture. I wish I'd thought of it soon enough. I just thought of it now. That's why I didn't have it on the charter. I could have showed it to you. But I remember seeing it. And it's basically a fellow about to be baptized, and the preacher's talking to him, and he says, you realize that when you come into the church, that everything, all of you, comes with you. And then when you see him being baptized, you see his hand out of the water with his wallet sticking up in the air. Everything but my wallet. Right? That's the imagery. You don't have to worry about the wallet when you just give of yourself first. Macedonia was not about dollars and cents. It was about the fact that they wanted to give of themselves in service to God first, and everything else flowed in behind that. And I think sometimes we become consumed, and this is the preachy sermon part of this moment, but sometimes we become consumed with the idea that the way we help people is monetary. But when you give of yourself, there may be a whole host of other things that you and I can provide for others that has nothing to do with your wallet. It may be time. It may be your shoulder. It may be a talent or gift that you have. It may be all kinds of things. Talked to a fellow one time. He said he always wanted a truck, but you know why he never got a truck? He said because as soon as you have a truck, everybody knows you got a truck. He didn't want the phone calls. I said, well, why don't you just be thankful the Lord bless you to be able to have a truck? Right? And I'm sure if you were busy and you couldn't make it, somebody would understand. But when I had a truck one time, Billy called me. And I kept it clean. He said, you sure you load things in your truck? That's actually stuff for Bobby, I think, now that I come to think of it. But I'm like, yes, Billy, let's take my truck. We'll load things in it. Right? I'll wash it later. But right? And I'm just trying to show you, it doesn't, sometimes we think, well, I can't. We say I can't because we automatically think of monetary. That is what's going on with Macedonia. I get that, by the way. But for us, it may be different. Giving of ourselves may be vastly different than just contributing some monetary financial assistance. That may be what's needed. But it's not always that. And again, that's sermon form. I get it. So I'll that's all you get, sermonette in the midst of the Bible class. Thoughts or questions up to there? I've gone through that section pretty rapidly. I'll give you a chance. Yeah. And what a great concept when you think about it, Bob. Wouldn't it be exciting if all local assemblies exceeded the expectations? Not just in this matter, but in all matters. Imagine the overall benefit to the cause of Christ if every local assembly strove to go beyond the expectations. Because here's the challenge with low expectations. The challenge of low expectations is that they're low expectations. They're easy. If we set the bar low, and sometimes congregationally, and I suppose the Church of Corinth is no different, Church of Macedonia was no different, the challenge sometimes is how do you set the expectation where success can be held? Because right, you can set expectations that are so high that nobody could meet them, and you become what? Discouraged, right? You become discouraged because we had this expectation, we couldn't meet it. So you've got to recognize that situation. And so it's tricky sometimes to know where to set expectations to be both challenging and yet also ability to realistically to fulfill. But the truth is, we've got to raise standards and expectations from ourselves personally, from us congregationally. That's where growth will come from. And it starts with me. I don't think the church at Macedonia is able to do what they did if the individuals hadn't given of themselves first. The church got better because the people got better. Sure, go ahead, Dan. And so you're reading the account from when these proceeds from places like Macedonia and Achaia actually arrived to those impoverished there in Judea, there in the book of Acts. And so you appreciate the fulfillment of these things that Paul was speaking of. I'm sorry, I thought I saw there's where I saw the hand. I saw a movement.
If you look back at the first letter, it begins where Paul is saying, okay, some people say I'm of Paul, some of Apollos. So he's talking to these different factions. And then he starts getting into the problems, like the people that supported this man who had a woman he shouldn't have. And then the people that were eating and drinking, taking the Lord's Supper like a real meal. These people had a lot of factions going on.
Yeah.
And, you know, he's bragging on them here. You all came together, you did this. And, you know, praising them for doing that. Because a lot of times you can't get a faction broken up.
Yeah. Yeah, there is things for him to be praiseworthy as it relates to them resolving some of those things, to be able to come together and resolve these issues. And now he's, in some senses, he's taken that new bond that they've built and challenged them to a new task to follow in the example of those in Macedonia. Insomuch, verse 6, that we desired Titus that as he had begun, so he would also finish in you the same grace also. And so his hope is that Titus would be able to convey to the church at Corinth when he got there what Macedonia and other places had done, and they would jump and want to fulfill the same thing. Therefore, as you abound in everything, in faith and utterance and knowledge and in all diligence and in your love to us, see that you abound in this grace also. Now, almost what is that? I'm not all that hip. That by the fact that I just used the word hip says I'm not. But whatever word they're using nowadays, youngins back there, is this what they call passive aggressive? What I mean by that is Paul's like, Macedonia was in poverty and they gave beyond expectation. Corinth, you have what? You got everything. You abound in everything. In faith, utterance, knowledge, diligence, love to us. You abound. They out of their poverty, you out of your abundance. Get to it. That's kind of Paul's sentiment here. He doesn't point to Macedonia for no reason whatsoever. He's going to challenge Corinth. If Macedonia can do this despite their challenges, you can certainly do this because you all abound in everything. That doesn't require something of them in some senses more than that of Macedonia. It just simply means you ought to have an easier path in some senses to be able to fulfill this. And so you should abound in this grace as well. I speak not, this is interesting, verse 8. Now, probably shouldn't even bring it up because we got about 3 minutes, maybe 2. But he says, I speak not by commandment, but by occasion of the forwardness of others, and to prove the sincerity of your love. So, Paul says, I'm not speaking by command. Now, there is a command about giving, right? Paul addressed that in the first letter in chapter 16, right? In chapter 16, when he gave them exactly what we have taught the churches of Galatia and all the other churches, so do you. Upon the first day of the week, let everyone lay by in stores, right? So we see that that's the command. But Paul says, having these kinds of expectations on you is not a command. The command is to lay by in store to be able to help the needy saints. That's the command. The command is not about you must go above and beyond. The command is not about some abundance level that you need to offer. The command is about fulfilling the purpose that God gave to lay by in store upon the first day of the week. So Paul says, I'm not commanding you that you have to do exactly what Macedonia did, but I'm using it. I'm being forward about it because we've built this bond and relationship. We have this mutual connection between ourselves, and it gave him some sense of some liberty to have this kind of a stronger conversation with them about that. We'll come back to that, Lord willing, on next Wednesday, and we'll talk a little bit more about this concept of Paul, in some senses, making the application for them in response to the command. And so sometimes the application isn't the command itself, but this is how you could use that knowledge that God's given. We'll talk more about that, Lord willing, on Wednesday.